Tuesday, October 2nd, 2018,
Already it's October.
work session on financial...
Good Lord.
What?
Did you hear that? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Whoa.
And
What?
enter inner demons.
Why does it sound like there's like dishes rattling?
Can you share close? Can you try close?
Ooh, yeah, that's not going to work. Goodbye. Hello?
Not good.
Hello? Hello?
Testing, 1, 2. No.
God.
Hello? Hello?
All right, so we're just going to have to make do, and that's really going to annoy us all.
I can't.
Turn it off. And just speak.
Yeah.
Does it work?
Stir.
Hello? 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 Is that going up?
How about these? How about these? Testing, testing, testing.
Smart cities.
Testing, testing. 4.
whatever it is that we're hearing, is only in the room, in the chamber. It's not on TV, and it's not interfering with closed captioning. I'm going to push my luck and just hope that it's good. It sounds good right now. So this, of course, is the Financial Sustainability Budget Savings Work Session. And just as sort of a reminder, we also have a special council session immediately following this. But without further ado, I think we'll just push forward. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Council. My name is Tom Reinhardt. I have the great privilege of being the Chief Administrative Officer for the City of Portland. The Mayor asked me to organize these budget priority sessions in response to a long document and process that Bill Farver did on behalf of the city last year that you are all aware of. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here today and give you some background and context. I'm going to walk through the goals of what we hope to accomplish today and also seed the conversation for the October 9th work session, which is an extension and a continuation of this one. And then my colleague Claudio Campuzano from the Budget Office is going to do some background and context. And then the highlight of the session is our hope that Council will engage in a budget priorities conversation around how you want to direct our bureaus, at least the start of the conversation, to the budget cycle for FY 19-20. So how did we get here today? We have had literally hundreds of conversations about how to strengthen the budget process and adapt to the growing pressures we all face in an expanding city. I don't think it's a secret to anyone that demand for services is rising as the city continues to change from a town to a large metropolitan United States city. Over the nearly 2 years I have been with this organization, I've listened to these discussions among council staffs, directors, and staff at many levels. A broad hunger exists for a more stable and predictable process with more focus on council priorities and trade-offs that we all face. Before the last budget cycle, as I mentioned, Mayor Wheeler asked Bill Farver, a former colleague at Multnomah County, who also had experience in Portland Public Schools and Mount Hood Community College with budget processes, to observe what we do and make recommendations for improvement. Bill did that, observing budget advisory committees, council sessions, mayor and mayor staff meetings with bureaus and the budget office, independent CBO meetings, and also interviewing many bureau directors. It was a thorough and comprehensive process, which I know you saw reflected in the long report he submitted. You have all received copies of that. Bill is here with us today. Thank you again, Bill, for that Herculean effort. We appreciate it. A foundational element that was identified in that work, which was mentioned again and again by many of our colleagues across the city, is that we tend to focus our discussions with you as a council on marginal decisions, cuts and adds, instead of driving council policy directives through base budget construction. In other words, in maybe more simple terms, the council debate on cuts and adds each spring obscures deeper policy choices and prevents us from driving towards the outcomes you expect us to deliver on behalf of Portlanders. I recently had the privilege of attending the International City County Management Conference in Baltimore, Maryland. While my study of different public entities could hardly be described as scientific, I asked leaders from more than 10 cities about their approach to budget development. Each of them has a process for identifying shared priorities and crafting a budget to achieve them over many months, most of them connected to strategic plans over years. No one I spoke with structured their budget with a simultaneous process of proposing cuts and adds like the one our organization has grown accustomed to over the years. We are confident that working with council to craft priorities and link them successfully and seamlessly with budget development will take longer than 1 year, much longer. But it is best practice, and it gives us the opportunity to be both clear with our bureau teams and also with the communities we serve. So, next slide. 3 budget improvements that the mayor directed the budget office and my team to work on based on Bill's report. Earlier prioritization, earlier focus for the hundreds of people in the bureaus that work on the budget. Today and October 9th begins that work. We know that that work will be ongoing. A move to program offers instead of our previous budget submissions, a program offer model. We'll talk more about that on the 9th. Strengthen community engagement, which is being led by the Office of Civic Life and Director Sukri. Again, that is not a focus of today, but those are the 3 improvements that the mayor asked us to focus on. Goals for today, next slide please, We hope to educate council about the history and context for the Cal -1 approach, and the Budget Office will walk us through that. We will be setting up the council's shared priorities and outcomes sought discussion later in this meeting agenda. We will outline the directives to develop concept, and we will prepare more discussion for that on October 9th. The mayor asked for a couple minutes to talk about how he hopes this will improve our process. Mr. Mayor.
Yes, and I'll keep it fairly high level, but as the bullet points say, stability, predictability, and transparency. I'm hoping that over the course of this process, we'll have an opportunity to discuss what our core obligations are as a municipal government and what kind of funding it takes to do a good job with those core obligations. Longer term, we have to be able to fund those core obligations predictably. And as you are well aware, based on some of our past budget presentations, and as you're going to hear a little bit in the coming slides, given the financial situation our city finds itself in, it will be very difficult to predictably fund core obligations and core council priorities unless we're very intentional about it. And I think this process can help lead us to that conversation. Part of the concept here is also to be realistic with the public in terms of what our scope of control is, what we are capable of doing, and what our obligation is to the public we serve in terms of funding services on an ongoing basis, and what that actually means in terms of future resources. And then we need to be transparent, of course, with what those requirements are. I believe the program offer piece of this helps get to that degree of transparency. I believe engaging the City Council earlier in terms of what my colleagues' priorities are helps us with that process because it signals to the public the direction that we're going and the decisions that we've made about what our core obligations and responsibilities are. And it also sends an important message to our Bureau leadership in terms of where we're going and what sort of program offers that we would expect. And it allows us to focus more on the base budget. If we know what our priorities are and we're clear about it and we've agreed as a council, then that should send a pretty strong signal to our Bureau leadership about what kind of program offers they should be putting forward and where they should be spending their time and energy in terms of helping us to get a budget in place. And then last but not least, moving towards long-term goal setting and planning. It would be my desire that we use this process to create increased financial stability for the city, for the programs, for the bureaus, in terms of what we choose as priorities, and then that will in turn enable us to do better long-term planning and enterprise-wide management. So those are some of my objectives.
Thank you, Mayor. Claudio?
If I could just, Tom, one more thing. I really want to reiterate, it's very important for me to hear from my colleagues. What I'd rather do is have a proposed budget that reflects our priorities and is perceived as much as possible as a collective effort as opposed to here's the mayor's take on the budget. Because realistically, we all know with this form of government, if I put a proposed budget out in front of my colleagues that's too far off from what their stated priorities are, the time and energy and staff work that went into preparing that budget is probably largely wasted. So let's start from the beginning and make sure we get it right the first time.
Agreed. Great.
Great. Good morning. Thank you, Mayor, Council, Tom. Claudio Campuzano, Interim Director of City Budget Office. So before we move on to the questions of what to prioritize in this next budget cycle, we really wanted to take a step back and look at where our priorities have been over the last decade and how they manifest themselves in terms of where we spent our resources. So Tom and the Mayor have talked about making the process more predictable and stable. And really the structure of the general fund can actually be an asset in that effort. As you can see, while growth is typically slow due to the interaction of measures 5 and 50, it generates a reasonably consistent upward trend as property taxes grow at or around their 3% maximum. So this graph shows that, over the last 10 years, the growth in the general fund has been pretty considerable, and at about $179 million, or 48% over 10 years. That's an annualized rate of 4.1%.
I'd like to interrupt
Yeah,
because I know that Commissioner Fisher would join me in looking at the trajectory of those two. There's a kind of a clear turning point in 2014 when we started to recover from the recession.
Absolutely.
And I'm really proud of our city for recovering the fastest of anywhere in Oregon, and for the work that Mayor Sam Adams in particular did to make sure that we got back up.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think last year, harkening back to the work session for kicking off the budget process last year, I think the city economists showed what every other city went through during the recession, and the fact that at this point they are back to where they were before a big dip. And as you can see, we never actually had a big dip and had a slowing that was slower than the pace of the growth of our costs, for sure, but ultimately was a lot smoother than a lot of other locations. So we never actually saw nominal declines, certainly relative declines compared to our cost structure, but somehow, these last 10 years have seemed hard. And so, next slide. So really, over the same period, we've asked bureaus to put forward reductions in 8 of 10 years, and I think this gets at what Tom was saying about sort of this process of cutting to add and doing those things simultaneously. So, much of this has also been driven by off-cycle changes that have committed us to new spending, and the biggest component of these is labor agreements and other settlements. So, much of it has been
Claudio, if I could just mention and put out there, there are some potential external liabilities that could impact this budget. We don't know what all of them are, but there are certainly some issues which could potentially impact the budget going forward. And at some point, we might have to work that into the budget thinking.
I think that's absolutely right. And, we've talked a lot about the elements of the process change for this year around program offers and around trying to build within a constrained budget and reducing the number of decision packages by having council really direct the development of ads. But I think that as we go forward in the process change, one thing that we're really going to want to do is tighten up our process around financial planning and really looking out at some of those legacy liabilities and other issues that we know are out there, and figuring out how do we resource those and plan for the future. Actually, why don't we move on to the next slide? So this slide tells some of the story about where we've made our investments. These bars represent nominal growth over 10 years, and you can use the inflation bar, which is a little red one, and the general fund growth bar, the green one, as sort of guideposts for this. I'll caution you that really every bar tells a story, and not every story is about growth in service. But clearly the biggest one, and not unsurprisingly, our investments in housing and homelessness over the last decade have really been our most prominent in terms of changing our portfolio of investments. So starting the conversation, it started with the conversion of Serial one time. We made some additional investments subsequent to that. And led more recently to the creation of the joint office with a significant additional infusion of resource, followed by the conversion of more Serial one time in this last budget cycle. So really a pattern of continual investment in the housing and homelessness service delivery structure. Parks, very different story. Really the growth in the general fund here has largely been to support existing levels of service. We started with the backfill of the local option levy, which was a 2002 levy that was intended to backfill earlier cuts. So this was that was really a maintaining service by adding $5 million of additional general fund. Then there was also the recreation arbitration at about $4.7 million in costs. So that was also it did not result in an additional level of service, but really affected our cost structure. And finally, growth in the system funded by tax increment, and more recently, system development charges. We've been building a lot of new, and that's resulted in considerable operations and maintenance costs, as is appropriate as we build out the system. So, some of that growth has been for enhanced levels of service in areas that have parks infrastructure, like Director Park is sort of in this 10-year window. But we've also seen a lot of growth in areas that have not been served quite as completely over the last couple of years.
I have a couple of just brief comments. Commissioner Fritz and I were just talking about the League of Oregon Cities that had its meetings this weekend, and for the first time, we had a statewide meeting around the issue of homelessness. And I found it profoundly impactful to be in a room with mayors from places like the Dalles and Kaiser and Cottage Grove, talking about how the homelessness issue is significantly impacting their communities and how it's changing their budget outlook. And so, this is, I think, a really graphic example of how the dynamic around housing and homelessness has really created, I don't want to use the word drag on, because that's not fair. It's created another top priority for the city of Portland on top of the other things that the city of Portland already did around transportation and public safety and parks and everything else. And it's become a significant draw of general fund resources.
And I would note even that this is just the housing portion of it. As Tom knows, his facilities folks have gotten significant investments for campsite cleanup. Parks rangers have been significantly impacted by camping in parks. We've got the Portland Bureau of Transportation. It has their complaints for abandoned autos and RVs has grown considerably. So we've seen it not just in that specific housing allocation, but and through to the joint office, but also across the board in a variety of services. It's been very impactful.
The city and the county are now through the joint office. If we combine the little bit of federal and state funding with our county general fund and our city general fund, we spent $72 million last year on homeless prevention, shelter, and the transition to housing. Going back a decade to when I was county chair, it was probably single digits in terms of the amount we were spending by comparison. This really has become a significant budget buster for us. The second thing I wanted to raise is really a question. Why is the Bureau of Transportation reflected?
So this is just general fund discretionary, ongoing. So it's a very small piece of of their total revenue. So this is really just looking at the general fund
Does that include the voter-supported gas tax?
No. So this is just general fund, and so really, if you actually look at their total general fund budget, they actually have grown. It's just that now it comes in one-time chunks from capital set aside. You've also got we did reduce their ongoing several years ago related to the utility license fee. But they only receive, their base was, I think, $11-ish million, and so it's been reduced by several million, but they actually make up a very, very small piece of the general fund.
Thank you, appreciate it.
So I'll note the two bars in between the growth in general fund and inflation, police and fire. While these are, relatively small compared to some of the other areas where we've invested, because of the sheer size of those budgets, those actually have made a pretty significant impact on where the dollars have gone, and we'll see that in the next slide. So unless we have any other questions about what some of the other stories are related to these bars.
Claudia, no question, but just a comment. It's really hard to read this slide package, so just if we could make a pitch for the next one, just to have it be pumped up, even if it's a couple extra pages.
Absolutely. Sorry about that. And we will definitely address that. So moving on to the next slide. So this really gives you a better sense of where the actual the total dollars have gone, where that previous one gave sort of a relative perspective based on the growth in those individual functions. Really the main point here is that while we've significantly increased our relative investments in areas like parks and housing, public safety, particularly in the form of increased labor costs, have been a very significant driver in where the money has gone. So when we talk about labor costs, I'll note that between initial reductions at the beginning of this 10-year window and increased staffing recently, police is really only 10 FTE higher than they were in 08-09. So when we talk about the increase in dollars, we're really talking about an increase in the cost structure and not necessarily an FTE.
Claudio, I couldn't hear you. Did you just say that the police are only 10 FTE above where they were in 08-09?
In 08-09, yeah.
Though the cost structure has grown?
That's correct.
Precipitously?
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Thank you.
So happy to take any questions on this slide. Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay. So it really summarized it with the bar chart. But really, to put a fine point on it, it's very much been a question of labor costs over the last 10 years. Of that 178 million, about 122 million has gone to personnel costs. That's a 43% increase compared to the 48% increase for the general fund as a whole. So meanwhile, oh, I'm sorry. I usually speak fast, so I'm trying to speak slower. I know. I've addressed it by speaking softer. So 178 of the 178 million, 122 million has gone to personnel costs. So that's a 43% increase. Meanwhile, staff levels across the city, and this is not a general fund figure because it's very difficult to measure general fund supported positions over time, but they've only increased by 10%. So really, what makes up the rest? Salaries overall have increased by 30% in nominal terms, so that's not adjusted for inflation, but you also have health benefits that have increased over 50%. And PERS costs, exclusive of the pickup that we cover, have more than quadrupled over the 10 years. So while they don't make up a very significant portion of our budget yet, the trajectory is pretty impressive.
What has quadrupled?
PERS costs.
Oh, okay.
So the reason for that is over that time, rates have gone up. They've more than doubled. But then also you compound that with the growth in personnel salary costs, and you get that quadrupling of the.
Claudio, speaking of PERS costs, you may not have this at your fingertips right now. I was looking for some data on the city's website about our unfunded actuarial liability and our funding level, and it looked to me like the latest data was 75%, but that was in 2016. Do we have updated data?
I don't have it. Is it possible that?
Okay, thanks. If you could just send it to me, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
So that's really at a high level sort of where we've been, and we want to spend the rest of the session really talking about where we're headed, but so if you want to keep moving through that. So going into 1920, and that's very small. So really, the guidance that was released by the mayor last week reaffirms the budget note that was part of the 18-19 budget, and that bureaus should build their budgets with 1% less than what would have otherwise been in their current appropriation level. So I'll note that this early signaling of next year's constraint is really a key piece of some of the changes that we're trying to make to make this process more stable and predictable, to give managers the 14 months rather than the 2 months to start thinking through how they're going to address some of the challenges that we're trying to work through. Really, while the good news is that with 1% we're unlikely to need additional reductions, the less good news is that we're also unlikely to see much more in the way of new resources appear in the forecast. I'll note that this is the earliest that we've put down a marker about the forecast, and increases in the size that really increases the size of the error band that we're looking at. So we have tried to be conservative so that we don't face additional cuts later. But I'll also note that in recent years, a typical increase in ongoing general fund that we've seen between December and April has really been $3 to $4 million. So even, and it has gone up as high as 8 or 9, but it's also been, we've also seen a little bit of a decrease at some point. So in terms of what we might see later in the forecast with this guidance, there will not be a lot of general fund discretionary. One thing I'll also note is that the interaction between 2017 cuts, tax cuts, and the increased business license tax might result in a lower level of confidence around the forecast, just because we're sort of in a new environment with how businesses are reacting to particularly the 2017 tax cuts. So, and Josh will speak more about that when we do the forecast update later in October. So. Finally, before we move on to the priorities discussion, I'll note that there are several items that Council has specifically identified as priorities heading into 1920. While I'm sure there are others, these are the ones that we've already heard explicitly signaled that you're interested in taking action on. And so those are $2 million for ADA improvements, and that's on an ongoing basis in PBOT and Parks. They were both directed to request Cal target adjustments, current appropriation level target adjustments for those. And Parks was requested to ask for consistently $500,000 each year for their major maintenance until such time as they felt that they had a stable and predictable resource for rebuilding their assets. So there are a number of one-time items as well. The joint office obviously is a large one. We still have a significant one-time item, a one-time amount that we added in 1819. The Anderson lawsuit, we still have payment to make on that, and then also Mount Tabor. We've committed to the neighborhood that will continue to contribute up to $4 million for the restoration of the reservoir. So those are the things that we've already heard. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Tom unless there are any questions.
Okay. Now on to the main event. And as much as I know that our colleagues respect Claudio and I think that they are present here to hear the priorities conversation. I sent out a few prompting questions related to commitments that the city has made via the council decisions in previous years to try to help seed the conversation. But this is really your time to help us get directed for how you want us to develop a budget.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in and just start. I've been making some notes here as we've been discussing this in anticipation. Obviously, the issue around homelessness continues to be, from my perspective, the issue. It's certainly the one I hear the most about, and the city has approached this with a sense of urgency, and we need to be able to continue to approach it with a sense of urgency. I'm concerned about the percentage of funds going to the joint office that are one-time only. I don't see the homeless situation being resolved in the near term, and I believe it needs to be approached as though it were a significant priority for the city of Portland. And that suggests something other than one-time only resources going towards it. We made good inroads last year, but I think we have to continue to work on that issue. Livability continues to be, I'll just speak for myself, it continues to be a priority. And I don't see that as being a major area of expenditure, but I think there are things that we can do around trash collection and litter collection, basic livability services throughout the city, and there's some good partnerships that we could leverage there. Public safety continues to be a concern, in part. If we want to decide as a council that we would like to prioritize community policing, then we need to talk about what that actually looks like, what it is, what it looks like, and get some broad buy-in on that. There was a strong desire last year as we talked about public safety and homelessness and that intersection to talk about what kind of partnerships we need with the county, with the state, and other local providers around addiction services or mental health or domestic violence services, job training, and the like. And I'd like us to have a broader conversation about that prior to getting into the nitty-gritty of the budget. And last but not least, actually second to the last, and not second to the least, infrastructure. I think this council has made a strong commitment to parks infrastructure, to transportation infrastructure, to accessibility infrastructure, and I want to make sure that that remains front and center. We collectively passed the Build Portland initiative a year and a half ago, and I think that was a good start, but there's probably some other ideas we could shake loose there. And I'd like to work with my colleagues on critical staffing questions. Commissioner Udaley has been a outstanding commissioner in charge of the Bureau of Bureau of Development Services, and we've had some really good conversations around staffing levels there. There are obviously some staffing questions in the Bureau of Emergency Communications, which Commissioner Saltzman is now responsible for. And there are undoubtedly other areas where we have some critical staffing needs. And I'd like to see if there isn't a way through this next budget process to prioritize some of those critical staffing needs and see if we can chip away at them. So those are just some of the priorities that I'd like to put on the table, along with whatever my colleagues think is important.
Pardon me. So, well, that all sounds great to me, Mayor. I guess the only thing that I would like to add is that, and I shared this with Claudio yesterday, I'm just really hoping that we can engage the public in a much more meaningful way, and that may involve a harsh reckoning about some of the things that we're spending money on right now. Because in my mind, in the middle of a housing crisis, in the middle of a homeless crisis, without adequate resources for people who are experiencing mental illness and addiction, we really need to triage the city and triage the budget and ask community members who are better off, who have historically been much better served, to step up and fill in the gaps of some of the non-essential stuff we're doing. I know that the Tabor Park community just raised $100,000 for something they want up there and realized that the city wasn't going to do. I'm not suggesting that every neighborhood has those resources, but it does seem that, and not to call out Park specifically, but we can't do it all, and people are angry that we're not doing better with these essential things around homelessness and livability. Then we need to engage them in a really honest conversation about what we're going to have to give up in order to address those basic needs for, yeah.
Commissioner Udaley, I want to state that there have been frequent conversations among bureau directors at monthly meetings and smaller group meetings that echo your sentiment. There seems to be a sense, and it links back to what I said in the intro about as we continue to try to meet the demands of a rapidly growing city and the policy direction of council to respond to those legitimate demands, there seems to be kind of fraying at the edges around how do we continue to run the bureaus the way we have since decades past. And we are facing now real serious choices about some things that to many directors, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, believe we're putting some things at threat because of our response to creating new programs and doing things. And that's just a part of growing pains. But I think you use the term reckoning. I think internally we have to do that based on the direction you give us and to create some scenarios for you to really serve the council around. If you want to achieve these outcomes, we may have to change the way we're doing some business in other areas. So I appreciate that, and I think that you'll find a positive response to your own bureaus and to others across the city.
Thanks.
I think we've done a good job. I want to echo what Commissioner Udaley just said about finding the partnerships where we can. I feel like the council did a good job last year working with the business community on the business licensing tax for specific services, most notably the transition from the streets or shelter into housing. We found an additional $3 million thanks to that partnership. And this council has made a commitment for permanent supportive housing. And I think we're very, very close to an agreement with Metro and Multnomah County and Travel Portland and others around a targeted source of revenue that we agree on that could help us support those efforts. So we need to really continue to be innovative and creative in thinking about what partnerships could exist.
Let me jump in. First, I have a question and then a couple of comments. One of the slides took us down memory lane in terms of past efforts to get the council to go through an exercise where they identified cuts, even when we knew we weren't going to take them, to help identify core programs and non-core programs. And the truth is, it never really worked as intended, and it did cause an enormous amount of anxiety in the community, at the Bureau, and ultimately, probably an excessive number of Washington monuments were offered up. So I guess one question I have, and I don't need an answer today, is it the mayor's intention to take 1%? Is it his, is he going to reserve the flexibility to take 1%? Is it his intention to reserve the flexibility to take the 1%, at least recommend the 1% that he deems to be the most fruitful? And then, given that not all general funds bureaus have prospered equally, will he be treating all general fund bureaus the same, or does he reserve the right to treat them differently? So that's a question as we get into the guidance. But let me put a couple extra data points on the table. If ballot measure 102 passes, we'll be able to probably stretch the tax dollar on the remaining housing bond expenditures by at least 50%. I hope that's a floor, not a ceiling. If 26-199 passes, we're looking at about $250 million for Multnomah County in additional resources for affordable housing, and there are quite a number of projects that are shovel-ready. So that's good news. When I joined the council in 2008, we had what was then a structural problem around housing and homelessness, particularly homelessness, where most of our funding for the homeless services, and it was a fraction of what we're currently spending, was funded with serial one-time money. I think it's very important that we opportunistically convert as much as possible to ongoing. So I think that needs to be a priority. When we get our forecasts and we figure out how much one-time and ongoing money, I think putting homeless services on a strong foundation and just getting out of what we all concede is a bad budgeting practice of serial one-term funding is a priority. I want to just make a comment that I think we also, in the area of housing and homelessness, need to do a better job of aligning who is actually being asked to spend general fund resources to tackle the problem. So, for example, embedded in the parks budget is some funding that goes to rangers and others to do things which, if we were to back that out and just make sure that all of the housing and homeless services were reflected in one line item, parks would get a credit for some of the expenditures that they're currently making, and I will be advocating for a better alignment so that, not because I think it's inappropriate for parks rangers to be doing some livability work, but I think that they should be funded out of a different pot for work that they do that goes beyond the core mission of parks, because parks rangers are not exclusively in the business of doing housing and homeless service work. I'm glad the mayor mentioned permanent supportive housing, and I'll be looking for the 10-year roadmap for how we're going to fund the service side, and that goes to what Commissioner Udaley mentioned about how we deal with addiction and and mental illness. Just in the addiction side, we are fourth from the bottom nationally in addiction services as a state. We're 50 out of 51 in terms of access. So, we're fourth in the nation in terms of need, and we're 50 out of 51 in terms of access to services. So we sort of get a failing grade at both ends. And the default has been increasingly asking local government to pick up the slack. Permanent supportive housing is one way we do that. But these were traditionally functions that were covered by the federal government and the state government. And it is, I think, regrettable that we're being asked increasingly to take on, and the county government, and we're being asked to take on responsibilities which are not part of our core mission. So let me summarize. We're going to have, if things turn out the way we hope, we're going to have a substantial amount of new money to spend on building and preserving affordable housing. We've got to figure out how to provide the service side of that, and so Section 8 vouchers, PSH, and other things. But that would be at the top of my list. And then we have to continue to convert on a one-time to ongoing opportunistically as is available. In terms of parks maintenance, which for me is a close second, I want to back out stuff that's being done by parks employees that otherwise should be funded out of a housing and homelessness pot. We're willing to do our part, but I think there has to be a better alignment between the services and the funding. Mayor, you mentioned Build Portland. I think we have to look at ways of being flexible with that spending, particularly in the areas of major maintenance. And we really haven't opened that conversation. We haven't reopened that conversation in light of some of the challenges we face in terms of major maintenance. And I would throw in the unreinforced masonry debate, because we're going to have to come up with some compensatory, some offset, and that is at least one pot of money. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge that you can look at the slides that we got, and you can tell different stories. There's a story, though, that I think is missing from the slides, and it goes something like this. From the teeth of the recession in 2008, for about 5 years, certain bureaus took it on the chin, and Parks was one of those bureaus. Now, the reality is that the numbers are masked a little bit because of a decision by a mayor to put a teen program in place, because of the additional O&M that accompanies Commissioner Fritz's ambitious plan to bring Parks equity to East Portland, and because of a couple of other decisions. But what it masks is that Parks currently has fewer people doing Parks maintenance today than they did in 2008. That's not sustainable. You cannot continue to grow the pie and ask people to do more with fewer bodies. It's just not tenable. And while the recovery period has been robust, it's been robust not in the core areas where Parks needs bodies. It's been largely driven by boutique initiatives like, again, the teen program, like building in the O&M, which is council policy, and other things. So I think under livability and Parks maintenance, we have to take a good hard look at the complement of workers and ask some tough questions about, do we have enough people doing park maintenance? And from the initial briefings I'm getting, the answer is no, but the 10-year numbers mask the steady erosion of people doing that work. We cannot promise people a vaunted livability without having people delivering that work. So for me, housing and homelessness, livability, parks maintenance, major maintenance, public safety, something in that order, Mayor, as a first cut, and with the nuances that I've enumerated. And so thank you.
Good.
Well, first, thank you, Mayor, for stimulating the conversation, and Chief Administrative Officer, Budget Office, for all the work that's been done. I think it's very clear that we could improve and should improve our budgeting process. And in some ways, this year is going to be a relatively easy one to do that if the current appropriation level stays somewhat flat and bureaus are mainly asked to reorganize their budgets rather than adding. We had, as I noted on the previous slide, 2 years of the 10 that I've been here that we actually took a breather and did something like that, which then gets to be more like biennial budgeting rather than the constant changing. But so that it makes it a little bit easier. But in the Commission form of government, the budget process is not only about setting the priorities and allocating the money, it's also the opportunity that all 5 members of the council have the opportunity to hear from each of the bureaus, to find out about things that are going on in different bureaus that we either haven't ever been in charge of or are not currently in charge of, and to weigh in based on the cuts and adds about things that we like or don't like in those bureaus. That's the one time we get to allocate the money to do things that we might want to do in another bureau if we were in charge of it. So I think it's really important to recognize that although your discussions at the national level are useful information, the Commission form of government is what we're working with here, and we need to respect that we're not just trying to get from A to B, we're trying to learn along the way, and the council has this opportunity. I cannot possibly meet with 25 or so directors between now and next week, or even now at the beginning of the budget, to ask what's going on in your bureau, even if I have to ask my colleagues for permission to meet with their bureau head to find out what's going on there. I think there should be a process whereby the commissioner in charge works with their bureaus to decide what are the priorities and then puts those forward, and that's the menu of things that I have to choose from. I also am very concerned about just the question, what do we mean by priorities? I mean, just because obviously housing is a huge issue, does that mean we don't fund anything else? The principles that I used when we were looking at the 2014 bond measure expenditures and the system development charges in parks was that we would prioritize using the equity lens where those resources went, and everybody would get something, because it's not reasonable to expect we could sink every last dollar we've got in this city into the housing issue, and as the mayor just said, because it's an Oregon issue and a national issue, not a Portland issue, we still wouldn't take care of all of the issues. So I think it's really important to recognize that there are other livability issues, including parks and community engagement, that need to be funded. I'm 28 days into my new assignment, so I'm only starting to figure out what would the Office of Equity and Human Rights need in terms of having 11 people who are charged with the equity work throughout our 6,000 member organization. The Water Bureau obviously is different because it's rate funded, and still there's lots of things. I mean, I haven't even had a chance to have a conversation with Commissioner Fish yet about how I can be supportive of his priorities in parks. So I was very happy to hear your suggestions, your thinking on some of the things that you'd like to do there. Obviously, from before I got on the council until now, my priorities have been equity, parks, and community engagement. And so those are not things that I think can be ignored because we have these other challenges that we need to address. The other question is, you know, under the Saltzman principle, which I don't know whether we're going to keep calling that after next year, but under the Saltzman principle, we know that because of the conservative nature of the forecasting, which I appreciate, there usually is a little bit of ongoing and quite a lot of one-time money to expend. If we don't have a lot of packages on the table, then we're choosing how to spend that money from not the entire universe of what the city does. And everything that the city does is something that somebody wants to have happen. It's over the course of the recession, and particularly the year that we had to do 10% cuts, or was it 25% we had to put on the table with the first, no, it's 25 million that we had to cut the first year of Mayor Hales. We certainly scrubbed everywhere to look. You know, I often say, if there was a magical bucket full of money somewhere, Sam Adams would have found it, and if he'd have left it behind, Matt Hales would have found it. And similarly, you've been scrubbing the budget for 2 times now, and so there isn't a huge gap there. And in fact, as Commissioner Fish said, a lot of the bureaus made their cuts by cutting administration, and particularly in parks where planning and administration went really downhill, not in terms of the quality of service, but just in the amount of work that we're asking a fewer number of people to do. So even the 1% CAL cut, which is supposed to not impact frontline services, it's not possible to do that in some bureaus because they're already stretched so thinly that you can't make that cut. And so where are we looking at an equitable redistribution of funding, especially knowing that police and fire are the biggest chunks of the general fund, and if they're not putting up cuts that are going to help other people or other bureaus, we, again, have to be more cautious about how we set our priorities. So I am concerned about when we have the additional money, how we're going to prioritize that. I agree with the principle that we shouldn't do ongoing needs funded with one time, except where absolutely necessary. And to me, the joint office, hopefully at some point, we are going to turn the corner on housing and houselessness. So that would be one that we need to weigh priorities in terms of ongoing stuff, because we all know it's really difficult to hire quality folks if it's a temporary assignment or only one-time funded. And yet there are some needs in all of the bureaus, I'm sure, where we need additional staff because we've got more people in this city. So that's part of the conversation as well. And then finally, I think there's always a backstory as well. And, you know, you mentioned the Mount Tabor reservoirs, which Commissioner Daly then questioned, is that a priority? We have to do that. It was a land use decision that we are required to do, and we wouldn't be making our drinking water more safe by having by not using the open reservoirs. If we had not come to that agreement to settle the land use case, we'd still be running up the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court, probably. So, you know, I appreciate the Budget Office, the Equity Office, the Chief Administrative Officer digging into all of the Bureau issues, because there's always more to take into account. And so my final question then is, how will the community participate in setting these priorities? We've, you know, actually laid out a laundry list of about pretty much everything City does has been mentioned. And how are we going to ask the community, do you want us to not fund parks in order to fund housing and houselessness, or do you want us to put more money to police or not more money to police, those kinds of things?
I know you're itching to get in, Commissioner Daly, but can I just respond really quick? So Office of Civic Life under Director Reese' leadership is working on this, and justifiably they haven't been quite ready to roll out any models until we go through a couple of these sessions with you. So this is a different process to move that from the Budget Office to Civic Life, but we're very aware that we need to give some options to council for the engagement on priorities. I will say, I think your points are well taken, and we are going through a parallel process with bureau directors on our responsibility in this process. So when you raise the point of, you know, we could have ongoing and one time, two of you have mentioned to me in my short tenure here that we work best when the bureau directors provide you full information and options early, so there can be some discussion and debate. Our process has lent itself historically to lots of end work and not a lot of front-loading work on priorities and options. So assuming if we make the assumption that we do have one-time or ongoing, the better prepared we are on scenarios and packages for you related to your priorities, the better the conversation is among you and your staffs around where does that one-time go this year, where does the ongoing go. And I think from the nodding of my colleague here, that has been the experience, that we as professional leadership have felt a little bit underprepared and not doing the best job serving you in those final few weeks of the budget cycle, because we haven't gotten some of these questions cleared earlier, and we haven't been able to present the options as thoughtfully as we want to. Is that a fair assessment, Claudio?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think that, you know, one of the goals of these earlier sessions is to start to ventilate what some of those priorities are, and the question about will we know, how will we know all the things that are on the table? Ideally, you know, we won't be in a situation where on January 31st, February 1st, when bureaus submit their budgets, we have, like we did last year, and it's very typical in years past, $33 million of requests that every one of which represents sort of expectations that have been generated throughout bureaus and in the community, and rather really honing in that list to those things that really meet the priorities that folks have been talking about today.
Sorry, Chloe.
So I just wanted to back up and elaborate on an issue Commissioner Fritz raised, which is, while I'm generally supportive of this new approach, I don't necessarily think that it is fair or equitable to ask all bureaus to do this, to offer up the same 1% cut. with the Office of Equity and Human Rights being a relatively new bureau, still building capacity and not having adequate staffing to really carry out what they've been charged to do, I don't think it's reasonable to ask them for a 1% cut. With the Office of Community and Civic Life, although it has been around since the 1970s, it's gone through a massive, the office has taken on and been assigned more and more responsibilities by council without necessarily being provided with increased FTE or funds. Oh, I want to say hello to this classroom coming through here.
Where are you guys
Hi,
from?
guys. Grant High School. This is actually my son Henry's classroom.
All right. Welcome.
I don't see him though, which is a little worrisome. Did Henry make it to school today? Okay. Hi. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Always a mom, right?
Yes. Sorry, let me gather my thoughts
Appreciate you, Daly. We'll
again.
give you a minute to get back on
Yeah.
track. Don't we?
So we are in the process of, revisioning community and
Right.
civic life, building capacity, professionalizing our bureau. We're about to undertake a really vital census project, which is critical to the city, that we capture as many people as possible in the census during a time when people are vulnerable populations that we desperately need to have counted are afraid to participate. And so trying to cut our budget by 1%, there he is. Would really potentially undermine those efforts. So I'm suggesting that we may have to come up with an alternate scenario for these really small, lean bureaus that are doing an extraordinary amount of work with very limited staffing and resources.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Could I just get some clarification? You said that the public process for the budget is moving from the Budget Office to the Office of Community and Civic Life.
I think that it's more that we're really engaging in a partnership with Civic Life. Since we were created as an office about 6 years ago, we initially had the support of a large bureau's communication staff to run a full community engagement process. Since then, we really only have one administrative staff member on our team, and that's our executive assistant. And while I think that we've done a very good job of sustaining the process that we've had, I think that we are a team of analysts and not community engagement experts. And so I think that working with the city's community engagement expertise to really figure out how do we do this right is a very good step in the right direction. We really look forward to continuing the partnership.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I agree. Again, we do have the commission form of government, and the Budget Office answers to all five of us. Commissioner Udeli is in charge of Civic Life, so I would assume then that you will be making the rounds to clear whatever it is that you and the Office of Civic Life has decided upon, and then the rest of us would have some input into whether or not we think that would work.
Yeah.
If I could add to that, I thought one of the things that was really lacking in last year's budget process is we didn't do a budget 101 with the public. And I think there should be an opportunity where people can come to a freestanding meeting with their questions. And the truth is, one of the responses that we get to that kind of suggestion is, well, that will be a very self-selected group. Unlike our public hearings. I mean, yes, there are some people that are more motivated than others, but it seems to me the goal should be to make sure that we're talking about baseline information. And there are some people that have the time and the motivation to go a little deeper. So I think there should be a Budget 101 session that people can come to, and it should be in an accessible location without the council. I also think we should go back to having a skinny version of the Budget 101 before we have our public hearings. And there should be a handout that helps people understand, 10-year trends, where we are, because without that information, it has a predictable, rhythm to it. And I think we got to get in front of that by making sure that people understand baseline information, and therefore that we can say to someone, appreciate that you have a passion for this. Is there an offsetting cut that you'd be willing to consider, or if you had to do a forced choice? And I know we're talking about doing a different kind of configuration, maybe putting people around tables, doing different exercises. I'd like to see people engaged in helping us make the tough choices, not just having us come yell at us. And frankly, we're structured to have people come yell at us, not to help us make tough choices.
Yeah, a couple of things on that. Number one, I'd like to say for viewers, listeners, that our office is always ready and very willing to come out and do a Budget 101 for whatever group would like to hear it. We make ourselves available to really talk people through how the budget is structured, where the decision points are, and how and generally how things work. So I just wanted to say, if folks have the desire to have us come and do a 101 with your group, please, reach out to us at City Budget Office at portlandoregon.gov. Second thing is, it was not, it was probably about 7 years ago, so Commissioner Fish probably remembers this. We actually did used to run the process quite differently in terms of engagement. I think Commissioner Fritz as well. You may remember the times when we brought community members and we did have them sit around a table and really work to so I see from your reaction.
I absolutely hated that as a community member. I got assigned randomly to a table that was with a bureau director. There was something that I wasn't interested in. I wanted to talk to the council. I didn't necessarily want to talk to somebody who wasn't going to be making the decisions.
Yeah, no, and I think that there are definitely different options for structuring that, but I think that one of the valuable things that came out of it was we did sort of at least in 1 year set up a situation where folks did need to engage in the trade-off conversation a little bit rather than coming in to specifically talk about their one issue. And I thought that actually did lead to sort of an interesting conversation at the various tables that I listened in on. So just food for thought in terms of as we try and create the community engagement process that reflects council's wishes. Just to put a reminder of that history.
Mr. Mayor.
Very good. So Tom, is there anything else, or should I wrap her up?
Yes, let me make a couple comments about October 9th and what we're hearing here, and make some suggestions, and we'll have further conversation with you and your staffs about how to best use that time. We got a long list of priorities from citywide electeds. So we are going to do some work, and the budget office will work its usual magic and good work from the collective energy from this group right here that I'm feeling during the session. In terms of honing some scenarios and working on the priorities that we can structure a follow-up conversation. Does that seem like a direction we should go? Each of you have a list. There's some overlap. There's some considerations of trade-offs. There's some pieces that could be good fodder for our next conversation. I'm hearing strong interest in community engagement and getting more clear on that in terms of where this is headed. I don't know if the Office of Community and Civic Life will be ready on the 9th, but we will follow up on that and make sure people are getting questions answered on that. Third, I think we should delve more deeply into the change that the Budget Office sent out around directives to develop, meaning there will have to be an affirmative stance from commissioners in charge to ask, actually council members, regardless of whether it's your bureau or not, to ask a bureau to develop a package to come forward. As Director Campuzano mentioned, we have averaged over $30 million in ad requests and 80 ad packages a year over the last several years, regardless of whether we're cutting or adding to the budget. One of the intentions of this process is to bring more focus from the council around what you want to consider so we can manage expectations in the community and use the Bureau's time more wisely. So we should delve more deeply into that, because I'm guessing, and I believe there should be questions for that process in terms of what Commissioner Fritz has mentioned around prerogatives of commissioners in charge and the commission form of government and how that is going to work. So unless I've missed something there, are we on the right track in drafting up something for council with those three? I'm doing it on the fly here, so I'm open if I've missed anything that we should be working on.
So the other challenge is that as Commissioner in charge, part of my process in deciding what to put forward is to engage the community in the budget advisory committees and maybe in some public meetings. So again, this doesn't, I'll wait and see what you have proposed next week, but I would want to make sure that community members are involved in identifying where some of the gaps in service are, as well as the council making our best guesses.
I agree, and as I said at the outset of this is going to be imperfect in year one. If we had our collective choice as directors, we would have started this prioritization process with you in August. We weren't there, right?
Well, we didn't have the same bureaus in August either.
But as citywide electeds, generally speaking, there are some priorities that you hear all year, and we think it would be instructive for us to start shaping up what literally hundreds of people do in the bureaus to give you the options that you are considering each year. Commissioner Fish.
Oh, this question, though, about do you treat all general fund bureaus the same, you know, and what's the impact of a 1% cut to a small general fund bureau versus a big one? That's been an unresolved question in a lot of our work, so I'm glad that it's been ventilated. Just anticipating our conversation next week, quick question. When do we get our next forecast?
December, says the city economist.
December, okay. Just tipping my hat a little bit, you know, and I realize this is more for next week and future discussions, but I like the idea of going back to having the commissioner in charge present the budget with the director to the council. I thought that aligned the accountability in a more direct way. And frankly, some of the confusion in the last year's budget process came because we disconnected the commissioner in charge from the budget presentation. So I think that's important. I also like the idea of the commissioner in charge signing off on any budget ads. And so we're very clear that it's owned by a commissioner. But I want to, again, just leave for us to chew on this question about whether all general fund bureaus are going to be treated the same, because obviously when you look at the 10-year history and you think about the impact on smaller, well, we've had this discussion every year around the arts. I think we're going to need to resolve that in the context of the forecast. But I think we have a little time on that one.
Director Campuzano, anything to add about the 9th that is preformed in my mind that you can improve?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. Mayor, Council, that's what we have for you.
Yeah, so I have one more issue, and it's maybe a smaller one, and maybe it's under the umbrella heading of communications. I don't feel like we do a very good job of presenting the final work to the public in terms of what decisions we made and why we made the decisions we have made. And I'll give you a somewhat imperfect example. I believe this city council is fairly well unified around our formula to address homelessness in the community, and we're fairly well unified with Multnomah County through the Joint Office on Homeless Services. Last week, the city council heard testimony from a group of citizens who came in, residents who came in, I believe it was from Laurelhurst, and they gave a compelling presentation on their belief that we should be doing more around homelessness, livability, and public safety. Tomorrow, we're going to hear from a completely different group what I expect to be something along the opposite message based on the forms that have been filled out. Then we're going to receive a petition from the Montavilla neighborhood that I believe some 4,000 people have signed saying we're not doing enough around homelessness, livability, and policing. Not to be confused with the petition we received last year from the Montavilla neighborhood saying that we were being excessive in our response to homelessness and livability and public safety in Montavilla. So the council is fairly well unified on this issue. The community is sharply divided. And I believe we have an obligation to help facilitate the conversation and the discussion about why we have come to the decisions we have and why we feel confident in the strategy or at least reasonably confident in the strategy that we've selected. I understand, given that there's 5 commissioners, we're not always going to have complete unanimity on every issue, but we're at least moving in the same direction at the strategic level. And so I feel like there's something missing there in the final presentation of the process,
Interesting.
and I'd like to explore that with you. We
Yeah,
don't
no,
have
and
to
I
do
think
it today,
actually
but-
that is precisely what we are trying to get at with the move to program offers, which I know you're very supportive of, really to help set that larger context, to talk about our efforts more broadly and more consistently, and less about all of the little tiny decisions that happen as we go that can create a lot of discussion, but are not necessarily very reflective of the overall effort that we are as a city are making. So I think that recontextualizing of decisions through program offers is really one of the big changes that we hope will help that issue.
Well, we should talk about it, because sometimes the budget gets adopted and everybody, frankly, has gone through a long and arduous process, and we just sort of move on. And I feel like there's just one more step that needs to be taken. Commissioner?
Could you explain a bit more about what you mean by program offers?
Sure. So this is really, it's effectively an extension of how we currently provide programmatic information. Right now, bureaus provide narrative around the programs that they run, but very frankly, that narrative happens to be at a very high level that's often not particularly understandable to the layperson and doesn't necessarily connect sort of what the program is and does and is expected to achieve with the resources that are applied to it. Those narratives tend to be at a high enough level where the narratives become somewhat bureaucratic in nature, and we're looking to move them more towards a very concrete narrative that's much more transparent about sort of this program is intended to accomplish X. It does it through this particular, it intends to achieve it through these particular means and has created this particular delivery structure to address that issue. And then consequently, we predict these particular outcomes with these particular resources. So really trying to tie it all together in a more digestible package, something that makes more sense for the community and also helps decision makers with the trade-offs that are necessarily involved in putting together a budget.
Thank you, that's helpful. That's what we used to do when I first started on the council in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And then it took at least half of each bureau's budget presentation in order to be able to get through all of that,
Mm-hmm.
especially well, actually in all bureaus. So is the intent to have that kind of Bureau 101 out before the budget process? Is that where I get my information about what the needs are in different bureaus?
I think that it's going to be something that evolves over time. I think that what we're talking about is it's going to be a competency that folks develop, that bureaus develop over time. I think that this first year we will be generating a lot of new narrative around programs. I'm guessing that it exists in bureaus in different places, and we're really going to be collecting it. But moving forward, I think that provides the starting point, and I think that this really gets back to the question of decision packages versus base. The vast majority of what we do and what impacts how we deliver services is in that base, and we do spend so much time focused on the decision packages. This is really an effort to, like I said, recontextualize that. So yes, I think this year it'll be challenging because we'll be seeing those complete program offers really at the end of the process.
What do you mean by a complete program offer?
So really all of that narrative, all of the desired outcomes, really all of the pieces that you described.
Offering for what, though? Offering for cut? Offering
a program offer is a term that the county uses. I think that is really sort of a program-based budgeting. So really looking at programs as a whole rather than the margins.
Can I offer a suggestion? Why don't we look at a couple models on the 9th?
Yeah.
And show you, and also explain to you how it will change the way bureaus actually craft their budgets according to the goals.
Yeah.
Part of my concern is having staff spend a lot of time on something that, in describing what they do. I mean, I know they've already done that with class comp and other things, and we've prepared some of these kinds of narratives for candidates in the past so that they have everybody has more of a grounding of what the different bureaus do. So some of that work will already have been done. And as I mentioned, many of our bureaus are strapped for administrative staff. So having them work on something that, of course, we're going to continue the aquatics program, for example, or, you fill in the blank in any other bureau. I'm not sure what the value of that is, except to say, well, gosh, this bureau does a lot of work in lots of different areas.
I think one of the values is that right now, to the degree that workload is changing in programs that operate in the base, the public and council doesn't really see that impact. If the appropriation level stays at the same level, but the workload is increasing, service levels are likely necessarily going to go down. And we're not seeing that in the way the bureaus are presenting their budgets right now. We'll only see it when it becomes a decision package. So I would say that one of the goals, and this really speaks to the I know that one of the points that the mayor is looking for in these budget changes is a level of transparency. The goal really is to establish a level of transparency, not just around what's being cut or what's being added, but what changes even if things stay the same with regard to resources.
I think, in some ways then it's helpful that we just changed bureaus, because obviously we all got memos of this is what the bureau does. I will say for myself, I'm still digesting, or in some cases even starting to read, some of the voluminous amounts of information that I've been given, and I'm waiting for multiple different briefings on different topics. Right. So, I hear what you're saying, and I think it is important for all of us to know that overview. Mm-hmm. Again, I just I want to make sure that we're not asking staff to do busy work.
Okay, great.
Just throw one other thing. I'm correct, am I not, that the auditor is no longer doing a community survey?
That's correct. We missed a year. CBO has actually, council did fund us for on a one-time basis to re-up the community survey. So that work is underway in our office. And
the community survey methodology has been questioned from time to time. Mm-hmm. I guess the value of the survey, one value is trends over time. And what we're accustomed to seeing is very high marks for firefighters, very high marks for parks, actually surprisingly high marks for police, given the conversation we often have at council and the community. There's a different voice reflected in the community survey. I guess one of my thoughts is, are there ways of using scientific research more strategically to help us craft a budget? The irony, of course, is that we're in the middle of an election season where almost every day a poll is in the field, asking people, questions about what their priorities are and how they're going to vote. The community survey performed one function. I didn't find it generally as helpful as something that goes a little deeper and helps us understand where are our broad attitudes among the 640-odd thousand people that we represent. And what ends up happening is we end up being, I think, especially responsive to organized groups that show up, organize campaigns, organize T-shirts, things like that, without, I think, stepping back and looking at the broader city. Now, I had the good fortune of winning my primary in May, but I will say that one of the things about a primary election in this town is that you end up getting to know a small number of people very well because they come to every forum, and it's the same group of people. And so to the extent we need to do a better job listening to voices outside of those who can travel to a hearing or who come on a Wednesday morning and share their views, I think thinking about how polling and other survey research could help us do that is very important. Mm-hmm. The mayor correctly observes that if you just went off of Twitter and social media, you get a headache trying to figure out, this because you get whipsawed all the time. But even that represents fairly small numbers of people that are very adept at magnifying their voice on social media. And there's a ton of people that don't have access to social media or don't have the time to engage, that we are challenged in getting their perspective on the budget. And anything we can do to magnify their voices, I think would be an improvement.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the survey, while it certainly had its flaws, did provide a very, theoretically provide a very good indicator of some of those broader voices. I think that Michelle Rubin in our office is working on that survey, and I would love to have her come in and brief your offices and get your feedback on sort of where you would like to see that headed and what kinds of questions would be important for council to be hearing the answers to. And I'd love for her to be able to talk to you about what the plan is for making sure that survey does reach out to some of the voices that have not been heard as strongly in the past. So,
Mayor, before you close, I just want to make a brief comment, mostly a thank you. This set of budget changes is going to be difficult. It comes in the context of a lot of other changes going on in the city, bureau directors, other shifts. A lot of people are putting time into this. I want to thank Aaron Rivera from my team, Jessica Kennard from CBO. The City Budget Office in particular, under Claudio's leadership, is undertaking lots of difficult tasks, not to mention a budget software upgrade. So thanks to everyone who's really put their shoulder to the wheel on this. I also want to thank our director colleagues. To a person, they have said, let's give this a shot. And these are folks that are under a lot of stress to deliver what you expect of them each day and what the public expects. So thank you for that. We're gonna need everyone's help. And I'm sure we'll get lots of feedback on this session from everyone, which is also a healthy thing. So we will test drafts with you for the 9th. We want it to be a productive session, and I hope it was useful for you.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Claudio. This was a very informative and I would even say fun session. We are, of course, as the leadership body of the city, we're responsible for ensuring that our budget process is transparent, predictable, and stable. And to better achieve these governance values, as we heard today, we're working across our commission form of government to implement what I think are some very exciting changes. Developing bureau budgets in response to council-wide priorities, setting realistic expectations for the people in the community that we serve by identifying priorities earlier in the process. Hopefully the community will have more time for meaningful engagement and strategic participation in this process from the get-go. And of course, we want to increase bureau efficiency by focusing on base budgets as opposed to just add or cut packages. Under this approach, the bureaus still, of course, build their budgets like the current appropriation level or Cal targets. I look forward to continuing this conversation with my colleagues. I appreciate the good work that they've already put into this process. I feel like we're way ahead of the game in terms of where we were last year, as Commissioner Udaley and I were trying to understand the deeper context of the budget process, and I look forward to continuing this. And since you mentioned that we are putting our bureau directors and bureau leadership under stress, they're all here. I want to thank you for working with us during this transitional year as we move towards a new improved process. It will create some hassles and some headaches, and there will be some challenges, but I want you to know we all appreciate it, and we understand that this will be an iterative process, and it will take more than 1 year for it to really reach its full potential. So thank you for the leadership that you're providing as well. Colleagues, we are going to adjourn the work session. We will come back into session in about 7 or 8 minutes for our special council session. We are adjourned. This is the Tuesday, October 2nd, special meeting of the Portland City Council. Carla, please call the roll.
Udaly,
Here.
Fritz,
Here.
Fish,
Here.
Saltzman, Wheeler.
Here. You want to just go ahead and, oh, sorry, Robert, I forgot you. I apologize.
Welcome to the Portland City
And Robert,
Council.
you can do the abridged version this morning.
The council represents all Portlanders and meets to do the city's business. The presiding officer preserves order and decorum during city council meetings. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. If you are in the audience and would like to show your support for something that is said, please feel free to do a thumbs up. If not, please do a thumbs down. Disruptive conduct such as shouting or interrupting testimony or deliberations will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given, and if you do not follow the warning, you are subject to ejection. Thank you for helping your fellow Portlanders feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe.
Well done. Carla, could you read our item for this morning, please?
Yes, item 1016-1, authorize city attorney to sue or join as a party in legal proceedings to maintain local control of and reasonable compensation for access to the City of Portland's right-of-ways.
Colleagues, today I've called for a special meeting to discuss a resolution authoring the city attorney to sue or join as a party in legal proceedings to maintain local control of and reasonable compensation for access to the City of Portland's public rights-of-way and city-owned infrastructure in the public right-of-way. Recent action by the FCC could result in inability to collect nearly $9.5 million a year in franchise fees and impose future limitations on collecting fees related to the City of Portland public's right-of-way. I don't need to tell you, based on the conversation that we had earlier this morning around the budget, that this would be a significant issue for the City of Portland. I'll now turn it over to City Attorney Tracy Reeve to discuss more. Thank you.
Mayor and Commissioners. I'm just going to briefly introduce the topic and tell you why you're here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Deputy City Attorney Maya Hyam, our intended to speed wireless and wireline broadband deployment. And those are, of course, goals that the city generally supports. Wireless carriers want to deploy 5G technology in public rights-of-way, and the FCC has identified, unfortunately, local governments as barriers to deployment. Consequently, because the FCC has taken that position, they've adopted a variety of orders and declaratory rulings that would significantly limit local control of public rights-of-way. The resolution before you would authorize my office to sue or join as a party in legal proceedings to challenge the FCC's recent and likely future acts relating to use of public rights-of-way in order to maintain our control of and right to reasonable compensation for uses of our rights-of-way. And I'm going to turn it over to Maya, and she's going to give you a little bit more detail.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners. Thank you for being here. We are very concerned about multiple orders that the FCC has issued. I'm going to discuss 3 of them, although there are more coming, and this is not the entire universe of orders that the FCC has issued. The first one was on August 2nd. It's a moratoria order that stipulates any local rules that have the effect of delaying a wireless application will be preempted. There are examples given of what a de facto moratorium might be, and that would include things that are cities regularly do. For example, a delay or a limited moratorium on the ability to rip up sidewalks or streets after they've been paved. Typically, there'll be 6 months or 1 year if we've just resurfaced a street that we say there's no excavation permitted, and the FCC is saying that that would be an effective moratoria and we could be sued on that behalf. That particular order also has some legal underpinnings that we believe are significantly suspect and lay the foundation for additional preemptions that the FCC has ordered. most significantly in a small cells order that would set the rate of reasonable compensation as our direct costs. The FCC then identified $270 per attachment for a reasonable cost. If we wanted to go above that, we would be subject to suit from any carrier who wanted to challenge our fees. And I would note that multiple cities have already entered into agreements with wireless carriers where the fee is $3,000 a year. So we're looking at about 10% of what many large cities have already negotiated. The third order and proposed rulemaking, which is draft at this point, but does include tentative conclusions, would significantly undercut our cable revenues. Right now, we are able to negotiate 5% of gross revenue for franchise fees and 3% for PEG funds. Now the FCC is saying, instead of being able to negotiate for both of those, we were going to require cities to have an offset against franchise fees for anything that we negotiate for in-kind contributions. Cities routinely do that. For example, in our Comcast franchise, we currently have 8 channel capacity dedicated to these types of channels. Comcast would be able to value those itself. We would be unable under the tentative conclusion to help value that, and we would then be required to deduct it from our franchise fee. So that's the universe as it exists today. We know that there are additional rulings likely to come, and we want to be in a position to challenge those.
Very good. Thank you. Colleagues, any follow-up questions?
I don't have a question, just have a comment. At the Oregon League of Cities board meeting last week, their board unanimously voted to support this suit. And I think the League of Cities in California and Washington are also being asked to join. So it's a significant preemption of local authority, and I think opens us up to more liability. I'm remembering the case we had recently at council where we had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars of compensation for someone who claimed that a utility box had obstructed their view in an intersection, causing them to get hit. And so I think for multiple reasons, this is the right thing to do.
Is there a public testimony on this item, Carla?
No one signed up.
Very good. With that, then, please call the roll.
Udaley?
So over 20% of the land in the city of Portland is publicly owned right-of-way, and managing that land on behalf of the people of Portland is one of the city's most important roles. Businesses that use publicly owned right-of-way, rights-of-way, and other city facilities to do their business need to share the responsibility for operating and maintaining the facilities that make their businesses possible. The FCC's action last week that limited local government's freedom to manage publicly owned property is sadly typical of the kind of mismanagement and corporate giveaways we've come to expect from the Trump administration. So I'm very pleased to support the city in joining this lawsuit. I'm hopeful that local power will prevail over the FCC's overreach. And I also hope that the next administration will appoint competent people to serve on the FCC who will help us solve problems instead of creating new ones. I vote aye.
Fritz?
Thanks to the Office for Community Technology, because I know you've been following this, and as has the Mount Hood Cable Regulatory Commission. Some of the other things that I learned at the League of Oregon Cities Board was that the administration is couching this as helping to provide 5G service to rural Oregon, which those legislators from rural Oregon thought was not a valid argument. Also, the mayor of Independence pointed out that Independence and Monmouth have provided wireless in their community, and that these rules would stop governments from providing these services. So it's essentially saying that government can't do what the community wants us to do, even if we have the resources to do so. So for multiple reasons, this is absolutely the right thing to do. I hope we fight it a long, long way if necessary, but I hope we get there quickly. Aye.
Fish?
Aye.
Wheeler?
We look forward to working with other cities across the country to protect the public's right to reasonable compensation for the right-of-way. Plainly and simply, this is a property grab by the federal government. We hold these public right-of-way assets in trust for the public, and it's our duty to fight for the right to manage these assets that we hold in public trust. We're still looking forward to working with the wireless carriers in our community in hopes to introduce 5G in a way that supports the Digital Equity Action Plan that's already been adopted by this council. But I think this is an absolutely appropriate, reasonable, and necessary step that the Portland City Council is taking in alignment with cities all across this nation. I vote aye. The resolution is adopted, and we are adjourned.